Hey everybody, since we have this new unit on heroes, I want to spend a little bit of time talking to y'all and teaching y'all about what we call the hero's journey. So let's get right into it. Go ahead and select the next slide. So we get the idea of the hero's journey from these two guys. The first one you see here is a Mr. Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist and psychoanalyst who was around in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He studied folks like Sigmund Freud, and he spent a lot of time discussing what he called the collective unconscious. I felt like that a lot of human concerns, right here, were based on a bunch of common recurring themes. And he felt that myths, as you see here, are foremost psychic phenomena that reveal the nature of the soul. Thus, the reason that we have a lot of myths that are very similar to one another are because they are kind of projections of our own inner turmoils or concerns. And around the same time, a little bit later, but still considered one of his contemporaries, was a guy named Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was an American mythologist, writer, comparative mythology, and comparative religion specialist. Basically, he wrote about all of this stuff. So he wrote about all these myths and came up with theories for how they worked. He eventually wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. This whole book was based on what we're about to discuss, this hero's journey. And this term monomyth is what he got from writer James Joyce, which just means a universal pattern that is the essence of and common to heroic tales in every culture. Thus, a lot of our mythology and storytelling have some very common elements. So here's a little quote from Mr. Campbell. He says, "The symbols of mythology are not manufactured. They cannot be ordered, invented, or permanently suppressed. They are spontaneous productions of the psyche." Again, we'll come back to this a little bit later. This is just kind of an answer to the question of why. Why do we even care? This is why. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So let's scroll down a little bit here. This is our hero's journey. This is what Campbell came up with. He basically says that most heroes have some steps that they go through. This is kind of a simplified chart, but and we'll discuss the more complicated ones later. But this hits all the big points. Basically, he says that your heroes are going to start here. They're going to go around the cycle and go through all these little steps into the special world from the ordinary world and end right back at the top. So let's see what this journey looks like. Quotes from So here's where Mr. Campbell says we get started. He says that most heroes start in an ordinary world. So by ordinary, we mean normal, boring even, safe, and generally non-adventurous. So as you can see up here, we have a little clip from Star Wars. This right here is Harry Potter. So it's very boring, kind of repetitive houses, normal cars, certainly no adventure therein. And then, of course, the Shire, which may seem to us kind of adventurous, but is a very safe and comfortable world where Bilbo Baggins lived. So this is where we start for most heroes. So then we move from this ordinary world to number 2. This is what Mr. Campbell calls the call to adventure. And again, you're gonna see a lot of different screenshots and pictures over here to the side, just kind of emphasizing how Joseph Campbell says that all these different stories can fit into this. So our call to adventure is when our hero is first given notice that everything's going to change, whether they know it or not. It's sometimes precipitated by a person or an event. So somebody might tell you that things are going to change and you need to leave, for instance, if you remember Simba. Or something might happen where you're told that you're a great hero and you have to do something to save the world. The problem with this is that sometimes we don't want to as heroes, or we can't. So then you get to the second step, which Campbell refers to as refusal of the call. So this is the point when the hero tries to avoid the adventure, citing things like their own weakness or inability to do so, maybe just a lack of confidence, like our friend Po and Kung Fu Panda from before, or general unworthiness. Also, Po exemplifies this. Fear, and it's not written here, but also comfort. So guys like this, Bilbo Baggins, he didn't like adventures, and nobody in his culture did either, which might actually tie into fear a little bit. Or you might have, like Mr. Incredible, Bob, up here. He, if you know the story of the Incredibles, he was refusing the call more to protect his own family, something that they weren't supposed to do anymore. Whatever the case may be, there is oftentimes a refusal by the hero initially. But then they are stirred to action. And oftentimes this stirring can come from the mentor. The mentor is a very, very, very common archetype. But sometimes it can be a little bit tough to pin down the mentor. And we'll discuss that a little more later because it's common with a lot of these steps. But the mentor is usually older and wise individual, and a lot of times he's magical. So you got somebody like this, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Yoda actually. So you might have a discussion with some people who would say that Obi-Wan was the mentor, and then others might say that it was more of a Yoda. Maybe it was both. This is what I mean by it's a little hard to pin down sometimes. But then you've got sometimes more obvious people who play this role, such as Rafiki in The Lion King or Gandalf in The Hobbit. The very common theme, and they play a very big role in helping our hero, giving him advice, stirring him to action, or even protecting him at times, i.e., Mr. Gandalf. All right, let's see where we go in the next step. So this is kind of the end of the ordinary world, right? So this is where we started in our safe place, and we were called, and then we had the hero who refused the call, and then met the mentor and decided to take on the adventure. Crossing the first threshold really has to do with leaving that safety behind and entering the adventure in earnest, right? The new world. And a lot of times they might even have to face what's called a threshold guardian, according to Campbell, or some sort of initial obstacle. Maybe, maybe not. So this is a scene from The Matrix where Neo has to choose the red or the blue pill to decide whether or not to cross the threshold into adventure or not. And of course, we have Alice over here looking down the rabbit hole. This is a physical representation of that threshold that she has to cross to enter into that world of adventure. All right, let's see where we go next in what we'll call the special world. Go ahead and punch that next slide. So here we are, having moved from our safety and normal world into the special world. This is when we have crossed that first threshold, possibly gotten past the threshold guardian or obstacle into the adventure. Once we get to this point, we start coming into contact with maybe allies. Timon and Pumbaa are some great allies, even some enemies, like the hyenas. Minor enemies usually come in early. And we start going through some tests, right? So you've got Mulan here starting to train. That was part of her this stage of tests, tools, allies, and enemies. You might even have a talisman show up, which this is kind of related to the mentor because it's a magical tool usually, or and if not magical, at least super powerful that helps our heroes. So lightsabers in Star Wars come to mind. But this is generally an area where the hero is strengthened or tested or starts to earn their name, right? So you've got battles can occur, minor battles, and they start proving themselves to their allies. And then we move from this initial area of tests, tools, enemies, and allies into what's called the approach or the innermost cave or the belly of the whale. Now, the reason that we have three different titles here is because, as I said, we're kind of choosing a simpler version of this hero's journey, and I'll show you the more complicated ones later. But basically, there are a lot of different archetypes or elements to this journey, but these are kind of the main ones that most of your heroes are going to hit. So this approach stage is really going to have to do with a descent into darkness or difficulty. This is where our hero starts to really find out who they are, learn something important about themselves. They usually will have some sort of temptation or maybe depression or have to face their greatest fears. So we see here Mulan is found out to be a woman, and that's kind of a bad part. That's our oh no moment. You'll have that in a lot of movies or stories where the audience and the hero themselves are thinking, oh no, this is something that can't be overcome. But the good news is it almost always leads to the it's on now moment. This is where maybe some atonement happens, encounters with a goddess or ideal feminine figure who usually give them more advice and strengthens their own identity as a hero. This is the main point of this period, is when the hero really accepts their role. Here we have Aladdin down in the Cave of Wonders when it's all closing up, and if you know anything about that story, you'll know that he leaves with the genie, which is a pretty exciting moment because he becomes Prince Ali at that point. All right, so moving on to the next step, this is what we're going to call the ordeal, and what Mr. Campbell refers to as the ultimate or supreme ordeal. This is the climax, if you will, of the story where our hero is going to meet his enemy face to face and get the real battle on, right? Again, we have Aladdin fighting the Jafar snake. This is what it all leads to, and even sometimes you have the death of the hero. This can be real death, it can be figurative death, and it might be a permanent death in the case of, say, a tragic hero maybe, or a not-so-permanent death. So let's see what we mean by not-so-permanent death. We'll get to that. After, of course, the hero wins, as we all know, the bad guys always lose and the good guys always win. You will have the reward. The reward can come in a lot of different forms. A higher state of being or awareness could just get the girl, or Prince Charming, of course. Oftentimes they receive their well-deserved crown or throne, right? Here we have Poe, after he gains the secret of Kung Fu. And down here, actual physical rewards being given to our heroes in Star Wars. The reward, though, is not the final part of the hero's journey. So jump over to the next slide and let's see what that looks like. So here we are, back to reality. If you'll remember, previously we entered the first threshold that brought us from safety or the real world or the comfortable world or the normal world back into the adventure world or the dangerous world. So we've kind of taken that cycle and gone from safety down to danger and back into safety. This is really 3 steps here. You've got the road back, resurrection, and the return with the elixir. These don't all always get hit, but some version of them does. This threshold, once it's crossed, you have, getting to the threshold, you have sometimes even a refusal to return. Think Batman here, right? So hanging up the suit can be tough sometimes. You've got, if they died, you have a possible resurrection. So in this situation, you're thinking of some of the very typical stories where your hero seems to be dead, but then when his or her true love comes to give them their final kiss, right? Matrix, that the hero miraculously comes back to life. Or maybe they even, in some stories, come back to life, but just in a new form. Sometimes they don't die, though. They always have, if they don't die, they have this freedom to live. And oftentimes in 2 worlds. Think Superman stories here. And Batman, general heroes who hide their identities. This elixir is referring to a power or a knowledge or a tool that was needed to save themselves, others, or the world. So they go through this whole journey and they receive from it something. They become a new man or a new woman. In some way they gain something and they're able to bring it back to the world with them. Even if they die, in the case of a tragic hero, they restore everything back to safety or normality. So that is kind of the end of the journey. But I have one more slide I want you to take a look at because there's some important things to keep in mind when checking out any hero's journey. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So the title of this last slide is that the hero's journey is a bag, not a box. That's kind of a clumsy metaphor just to tell you that it's not rigid. This hero's journey can be applied to a lot of different stories and in a lot of different ways, and just because a particular hero doesn't meet all of the qualifying points doesn't mean that the journey theory as a whole isn't practical or doesn't help us in understanding the story and the hero. Because as you see, this journey can be translated into a lot of different ways, a lot of different forms, and be more complex or less complex depending on the story you're looking at and how you want to apply it. Here you've got it bouncing around from Star Wars to, we get some King Arthur stuff going on here, Odysseus fighting our Cyclops. Basically, it can be used in a lot of different ways. Here's a really detailed and complex chart for the whole theory with all the different parts. The important thing is to remember that the theory is a great tool to look at stories as diverse as Cinderella and Fight Club. You can really find these in pretty much any well-written story. So the question that really we come to at the end of all this is why? Why is this even around? Why do we have this hero's journey concept? Why did Joseph Campbell write this book, and why was it so popular? Well, it's all about what those quotes said earlier in the presentation, that these stories are thought to be a reflection of what's called the human condition. And the human condition is something that is common to all of us. And that's why it's kind of interesting to look at this and to know that there's almost a formula for these heroes, is because it hits all the things that really are things that a lot of people fight with, right? This call to responsibility or something, and a refusal, and having a mentor talk us into it. That's the main idea here, is this concept that art imitates life. And so just keep this hero's journey in mind as you're looking at all the heroes that we're looking at in our unit, and and eventually designing your own hero. If you can have your hero fit this mold, then you will know that you have designed a very successful hero. All right, thanks.